Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really embarking on an incredible journey. We're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most famous travelers, Marco Polo. Maybe misunderstood too.
Definitely misunderstood in some ways.
Our source for this deep dive is a selection of excerpts from Marco Polo the Travels. It's a text just packed with detail, as rich as the Silk Road itself, you could say.
It really is an amazing window.
So our mission today is to unpack not just where he went, but what he saw, what he heard, what he experienced. We want to reveal a world that's maybe far more complex and surprising than you might imagine.
Prepare for some eye-opening stuff about the 13th century.
Okay, so let's start with how the travels even came about. Marco Polo, he was just 17, right? When he joined his father, Niccolo, and Uncle Maffeo.
Yeah, 17. It was their second big voyage to China. The first time, his father and uncle had actually gone on a diplomatic mission for Kublai Khan.
Ah, right. The Khan had asked for, what was it, 100 Christian scholars.
100 scholars and holy oil from Christ's sepulchre in Jerusalem. Very specific requests.
And the crucial thing about that first trip, as you mentioned, was they sort of accidentally discovered the Mongols had basically opened up the whole Silk Road.
Exactly. They got back to Acre in 1269, ready to report to the Pope, only to find Pope Clement V had been dead for months.
Oh, wow. So no pope.
No Pope. And the cardinals were completely deadlocked. Couldn't choose a successor, which meant no one could actually fulfill Kublai's request. So the Polos had to head back to Venice and wait.
And that papal situation got pretty dramatic, didn't it? 2 years go by, still no pope.
2 years.
I read the Italians got so fed up they locked the cardinals up, put them on bread and water.
And supposedly even took the roof off the palace, just to, to encourage a decision.
Talk about pressure. Eventually, they elected Tedaldo Visconti, who became Pope Gregory X.
Finally. And he gave the Polos credentials, some gifts, but instead of 100 scholars, he gave them 2 friars.
Okay.
Just 2. And even they got nervous pretty quickly. Heard about fighting between Mongols and Mamluks near Ayaz, and basically turned right back around.
So, not quite the delegation the Khan was hoping for.
Not even close.
Okay, so after all that delay, the Polos, Niccolo, Maffeo, and young Marco set off again for China. And this turned into a really grueling trek, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. 3.5 years just to get to Kublai's court.
3.5 years.
The text really emphasizes the conditions. Snow, rain, flooded rivers. Travel in winter was often just impossible.
And the route itself is described as puzzlingly serpentine, which sounds like they didn't take the most direct path.
Not at all. And there's been a lot of speculation about why. Why so many detours? Why did it take so long?
So if we trace it, they went through Turkey first,
Yeah.
Armenia.
Right. Turkey, Greater Armenia, the Caucasus, then into Iran. They hit Tabriz, Yazd, Kerman, eventually reaching the port of Hormuz on the Persian Gulf.
Okay.
But then there's this strange part where they seem to double back from Hormuz, heading back towards Quran.
Why would they do that?
Well, the thinking is they might have initially planned to sail to China from Hormuz. Makes sense, right? Go by sea.
Avoids the overland tract.
But maybe they were put off. Perhaps the Indian Ocean ships, the dhows, seemed too dangerous. Marco calls them deadly at one point. Or maybe the journey looked too long, or the monsoon season wasn't right. Something made them change their minds.
So they decided against the sea route. Then where?
They headed north, overland, into Afghanistan, through the Wakhan corridor, that narrow strip, and then over the Pamir Mountains.
The roof of the world.
Exactly, a huge detour.
Why go that way? It sounds incredibly difficult.
It was. One theory is they were trying to avoid conflict zones. Kaidu, another Mongol leader, was constantly challenging Kublai Khan in Central Asia. Going north might have bypassed his territory.
Makes sense. Safety first.
Or it could simply be that the northern route had more established, safer caravans they could join up with. Travel was seriously dangerous back then.
You mentioned Marco himself had a close call.
Yeah, he almost got captured by robbers in Persia. And the text mentions companions being taken captive, sold into slavery, even killed. It was not a safe trip.
Just to put it in perspective, how long did similar journeys take?
Well, compare it to someone like William of Rubruck, another European traveler who went to the Mongol court earlier. His journey took about 8 months.
8 months versus 3.5 years.
Exactly. The Polish trip was 5 times longer. It really highlights just how difficult and perilous their specific route must have been. An epic undertaking, truly.
Wow. Makes you appreciate just hopping on a plane. But these tough journeys also exposed Marco Polo to just an incredible array of cultures and customs. Let's dive into that. Starting in the West, what did he see in Turkey and Greater Armenia?
A real mix. He describes the nomadic Turkmens first.
Okay.
They were livestock dependent, worshiped Muhammad, but Marco describes them as, well, uneducated, speaking a barbarous
Oh,
language.
judgment there.
Yeah, the typical European perspective of the time, maybe. He notes they lived in felt houses, wore clothes made of skins, very much a nomadic lifestyle.
But there were others there too.
Oh, yes. He contrasts the Turkmens with Armenian and Greek traders and craftsmen living in the towns and villages. These groups were known for weaving really exceptional carpets, some of the best in the world, he says, and beautiful crimson silks, too.
So a real difference in lifestyles side by side.
Definitely. And then he mentions Georgia, ruled by a Christian king, David Malik. His people, the Georgians, were Christians following Greek church rules. Marco notes this interesting detail. They were supposedly born with an eagle-shaped birthmark on their right shoulder.
An eagle birthmark, seriously.
That's what he reports. He calls them brave warriors, good archers. And they had a unique hairstyle, cropped like clerics.
And wasn't there something about Alexander the Great in Georgia?
Yes. Marco mentions the legend of Alexander trying to pass through Georgia but finding the road too narrow. So Alexander supposedly built a fortress, the Iron Gate, to keep out the Cumans. Marco specifically corrects the record, saying it was built against the Cumans, not the Tartars, as some people thought.
So even back then, they were debating historical details.
It seems like it. It shows how layered the history of that region felt, even to Marco.
What's really striking is just how quickly the environment and customs changed as they traveled. He talks about the plains of Rudbar, right?
Yeah.
Very hot.
Scorching hot, yes, but fertile. Lots of wheat and exotic fruits you wouldn't find easily in Europe. Dates, pomegranates, lemons, pistachios,
Sounds nice.
and birds. He mentions huge numbers of turtle doves, pheasants, francolins, but then adds this detail. The local Saracens found these birds revolting and wouldn't eat them.
Revolting. Why?
He doesn't really explain why, just notes their aversion. Strong food preferences, I guess.
Definitely. And the strange details keep coming. He moves on to Tunken province and this famous dry tree.
Ah, yes, the solitary tree, sometimes called the dry tree. Marco describes it as really tall, unique looking, with leaves that were green on one side and white on the other. The wood was hard and yellow.
And there was a battle legend associated with it.
Locals claimed it was the site of a major battle between Alexander the Great and Darius of Persia. Whether that's true or just local lore, it adds to the mystique.
And Alexander pops up again in Badakhshan with the horses.
Right. Marco notes a specific breed of horses there, supposedly descended from Alexander's own famous horse, Bucephalus.
No way.
He even says they had a horn, though he adds, sadly, that particular breed was extinct by his time. A horned horse descended from Bucephalus. Quite a story.
Definitely. But Badakhshan also had some interesting human customs, particularly fashion.
Oh, this is a classic. The local noble women's trousers. Get this. They wore trousers made with 60, 80, or even 100 Ls of cotton cloth.
100 Ls. How much is that?
An L was about 45 inches, so we're talking maybe 75 to 125 yards of fabric, all folded into pleats.
Yards. Why on earth?
To make their hips look big.
Yeah.
Apparently, the local men preferred women who looked fat. So the more fabric, the bigger the hips appeared. A very specific beauty standard.
Wow. That is a lot of fabric for a fashion statement.
Mm.
And the peculiar customs didn't stop there, did they? He talks about mourning rituals.
Yeah, really bizarre ones in some places. Widows were expected to weep loudly for their dead husbands every single day for 4 years.
4 years. Every day.
Yep. And if they couldn't keep it up, or maybe weren't convincing enough, they could hire professional mourners women who were highly trained in the art of weeping.
Professional weepers, that's a job title.
It seems so. Then you get the really controversial stuff, like the hospitality customs in Kumul.
Ah, yes, this one's famous. The men offered their wives to visiting strangers.
Willingly. They saw absolutely no shame in it. The man of the house would actually leave for a couple of days, making sure the guest and his wife had everything they needed.
That's just hard to imagine from a European perspective.
Completely alien. And it gets stranger. At one point, Mengu Khan apparently tried to ban the practice.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the people of Kumul claimed their land suffered, crops failed, because their idols were angry about the ban. They actually petitioned Mengu Khan to let them resume the practice.
They petitioned him to bring back wife sharing.
They did. They said it brought prosperity and pleased their gods. And Mengu Khan, according to Marco, basically relented, saying something like, "Since you desire your own shame, you may have it."
Incredible. What a concession.
A really fascinating clash of cultural values right there. And it contrasts so sharply with other groups Marco saw, like the Xiansang monks.
Right, they were the opposite extreme.
Total ascetics, ate nothing but wheat bran mixed with water, slept on hard rod mats, just absolute minimalists.
And other monks didn't approve.
No, Marco says other monastic orders consider the Sansang monks to be heretics because their practices were so extreme. It shows the huge range even within religious devotion.
So much diversity. Let's shift to beliefs and superstitions. What did Marco observe about religious practices more broadly?
He details quite a few. In Tangut, for example, he saw idol worshippers sacrificing sheep, fattened sheep. Okay. And they believed the idols literally consumed the substance of the flesh, like the essence of the meat. Afterwards, they'd carefully collect and store the bones. It suggests a very physical interaction with their deities.
A concrete belief. What about at Kublai Khan's court? There were sorcerers.
Yes, Tibetan and Kashmiri sorcerers, or magicians. Marco calls their practices diabolical arts.
Diabolical. What did they do?
They claimed they could control the weather around the Khan's palace, make clouds and rain disappear, clear the sky just overhead while storms raged elsewhere. The Khan apparently relied on them for good weather.
Weather control.
Yeah.
Impressive if true.
And then there's a more disturbing observation. Marco says he saw these same sorcerers eating the bodies of executed criminals.
Eating human flesh.
Yes, but specifically executed men, not those who died naturally. He doesn't explain the reasoning, just reports it. Now, when we look back at accounts like this,
Yeah, how do we interpret that? Is it literal? Exaggerated? Misunderstood?
that's the crucial question, isn't it? Marco was a keen observer, generally, but he's seeing these practices through his own 13th century European Christian lens. He wouldn't have understood the nuances of, say, Tibetan Tantric Buddhism or local shamanistic rituals.
So he might have seen something involving human remains, but the meaning behind it.
Exactly. The why, the ritual context, might have been completely lost on him or interpreted as simply diabolical or cannibalistic in a way that fit his worldview. So we have to read these parts with, both curiosity and a critical awareness of potential bias.
That's a really important point for any historical source, especially one crossing such huge cultural divides. Okay, moving eastward into Cathay, China, more idols there.
Lots of them. He specifically mentions a system with 84 idols, each apparently having a specific job.
Like specialists.
Sort of, yeah. One idol helped find lost property, another ensured good harvests, another protected livestock, and so on.
Yeah.
Very practical applications.
How did the lost property one work?
It was quite a process. Someone would consult the idol keepers, usually via an old woman who acted as a medium. The idol, through her, would supposedly reveal where the lost item was, or even name the thief.
And if the accused person denied it?
The consequences were severe.
Mhm.
According to Marco, if the idol maintained the accusation and the person kept denying it, they could face having a hand or foot cut off. High stakes for losing your keys.
Definitely not worth arguing with the idol, but perhaps the most astonishing religious discovery for Marco was in Fuzhou.
Oh, absolutely. This is incredible. He and his uncle Maffeo stumbled upon a hidden community of Christians.
Yun Christians in China.
Yes. They had apparently preserved their faith in isolation for 700 years. They had books, likely psalters, and some paintings of apostles, but they lacked direct contact with Rome or other major Christian centers, so their knowledge was incomplete.
700 years. How did they react to the polos?
Initially, they were scared. They thought the polos might be officials sent by the Khan to investigate them, maybe punish them.
Understandable.
But the polos reassured them, identified themselves as Christians too. These hidden Christians then revealed their practices. The polos advised them to seek official recognition from Kublai Khan.
Did they?
Yes, eventually. They presented their case, and Kublai Khan, being pretty pragmatic about the diverse groups in his empire, investigated and then granted them official status and privileges. Marco estimates there were over 700,000 families following this form of Christianity in southern China. Manzi.
700,000 families. That's huge. An incredible story of faith surviving against the odds.
It really is. And it tells you a lot about how widespread ideas could be, even without constant contact, and also about Kublai Khan's relatively tolerant approach, at least initially, to different religions in his realm.
Speaking of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo gives us this just unparalleled look into the sheer power and splendor of his empire. Let's start with the Tartars themselves. Where do they come from?
Marco says they originated in the north, around Manchuria. Initially, they were nomadic tribes, living a pretty harsh life. And they were actually subjects, paying taxes to a figure known in the West as Prester John.
Prester John, that legendary Christian king.
Right, though his actual name, Marco clarifies, was Ong Khan. He was a powerful ruler in his own right.
And then comes Genghis Khan.
Exactly. Genghis rises up, unites various tribes, and famously defies Ong Khan, refusing to be his slave or vassal any longer. He starts preparing for war on a massive scale.
And Marco traces the lineage, right, from Genghis.
Yes, through the succession of great Khans, Guyuk Batu, Hulegu, who conquered Persia Mengu, and finally arriving at Kublai Khan.
And how does Marco describe Kublai?
As the greatest of them all, unequivocally. Greater and more powerful than any of the others. He even makes this astonishing claim that all the other emperors and kings of the world, Christian and Saracen combined, couldn't match Kublai's power or resources.
That's a massive statement.
It is.
Yeah.
But Marco clearly believed it based on what he saw.
Yeah. And a big part of that power was the military, wasn't it? The Tartar army.
Absolutely. Ingenious and incredibly disciplined. Marco talks about lords commanding huge cavalry forces, maybe 100,000 horsemen each.
Wow.
And they were organized very efficiently using a decimal system. Officers commanding units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000.
Like a modern military structure.
Pretty much. It meant orders could be passed down the chain incredibly quickly, and everyone knew exactly who to obey. Obedience was absolute.
What about their logistics, their endurance?
Remarkable. They could apparently ride for days, even sleeping on horseback while their horses grazed. They required very little maintenance compared to European armies.
And for food on the march.
They had some unique methods. Marco mentioned them piercing a vein on their horse's neck and drinking the blood. Sounds gruesome, but it's actually a pretty efficient way to get fluids and some protein without stopping. Perry. They also carried this dried milk paste. They'd put some in a flask with water, ride along, and the motion would mix it into a kind of thin porridge for breakfast. Very low-tech, very effective.
And their battle tactics. They were known for being cunning, right?
Extremely. Their most famous tactic was the feigned retreat. They'd pretend to flee, drawing the enemy out, scattering their formation.
Alluring them into a trap.
Exactly. Then suddenly they'd wheel around and launch a devastating counterattack on the now disorganized enemy. It worked time and time again.
So a formidable military. But that was just one aspect of Kublai's power. What about his court, his palaces? Xanadu.
Xanadu, yes. Xanadu is the more poetic name we know. Marco's descriptions are just stunning. He talks about this magnificent palace made of marble and gilded stone. It was inside a huge walled park, 16 miles in circumference.
16 miles.
Filled with fountains, rivers, beautiful meadows, and animals. White stags, deer, musk animals, all sorts of creatures roaming freely, providing food for the Khans, hawks, and gerfalcons.
And the roads were special, too.
Yeah, they were paved and raised above the ground so the rain wouldn't create mud and spoil the grasslands. Everything was designed for beauty and pleasure.
And wasn't there that artificial hill, the Green Hill?
Ah, yes. This is extraordinary. A man-made hill, apparently 100 paces high and maybe a mile around.
It's built from scratch.
Entirely. And Kublai had it planted with the most beautiful trees in the world. Marco says they were transported there, mature trees, roots and all, using elephants.
Elephants moving trees.
And the entire surface of this huge hill was covered with something green. Marco says it looked like azurite or lapis lazuli, though it was likely green glazed tiles or crushed malachite. Just imagine a huge, man-made green hill covered in beautiful trees with a green palace on top, purely for the Khan's aesthetic pleasure.
That's wealth and power on a...
By judges. They would literally assess the girl's beauty based on carats, like grading gems. They checked everything: hair, face, eyebrows, mouth, lips, general deportment. Also virginity, health, good breath, even whether they snored or slept peacefully.
Wow, quite the checklist.
The top 30 or 40 would be chosen for the court, ranked in batches of 6.
And how did that work? Serving the Khan.
It was very regimented. A group of 6 girls would attend him exclusively in his private chambers for 3 days and 3 nights, catering to his every need. Then they'd rotate, and another group of 6 would come in. No one else entered those private quarters while they were on duty.
A life of incredible luxury and structure. And the ceremonies. He mentions the White Feast.
Yes, the New Year celebration. It was a massive event. Everyone wore white. Gifts were exchanged on a huge scale. Elephants, camels, horses draped in gold cloth. And the level of reverence for the Khan was immense. Subjects would bow down before him, touching their foreheads to the ground. They'd even sense a tablet inscribed with his name, worshiping him, Marco says, as if he were God. It really shows that near-divine status he held.
It really does. And the hunting expeditions. The scale sounds unbelievable.
Mind-boggling. He had 2 brothers, nobles, who were masters of the hunt. They commanded, get this, 10,000 falconers each, plus maybe 10,000 trackers and support staff.
Just for hunting.
Just for hunting. And thousands of dogs. Marco mentions at least 10,000 mastiffs alone. When the Khan went hunting, these men and dogs would form a huge line, sometimes a day's march long, encircling a vast area and driving all the game deer, bears, stags, lions towards the center where the Khan and his nobles waited.
Like a military operation.
Exactly. And these hunting parties were obligated to supply the imperial court with 1,000 head of game birds and beasts plus fish every single day for 6 months of the year.
1,000 head of game daily. The logistics must have been insane.
Colossal. And his hunting camp itself was luxurious. He had this huge portable pavilion, like a palace tent, large enough to hold 1,000 knights easily.
A tent for 1,000 knights?
Adorned inside with incredibly valuable furs, lion skins, ermine, and sable. Sable was considered the king of furs. Marco says a single sable cloak, fit for an emperor, could be worth up to 2,000 golden byzants.
2,000 byzants? What's that in perspective?
A huge fortune, enough to buy estates in Europe at the time. It just underscores the immense wealth flowing into the Khan's court.
It really does. Okay, beyond the sheer spectacle, his actual governance had some unique features too. Astrology played a big role.
A huge role for the Tartars generally. They consulted astrologers and diviners for pretty much everything. Before any major venture, even just a trading trip, people would provide their exact birth details, year, month, day, hour.
Including that 12-year animal cycle thing?
Exactly. The astrologers used all this to predict the outcome. Would the venture succeed? Would they encounter robbers? Would they make a profit or loss? It was like a standard spiritual risk assessment before doing anything important.
Fascinating. And his financial system, the paper money, that was really ahead of its time, wasn't it?
Absolutely revolutionary, especially compared to Europe, which was still heavily reliant on metal coinage. Kublai Khan's empire had a sophisticated, centralized paper currency system.
How did it work?
The Khan's mint produced money from the bark of mulberry trees. It was cut into different sizes for different denominations, stamped with official seals, and signed by treasurers. Counterfeiting was punishable by death.
So it was official fiat currency.
Pretty much. And it was used for everything. Merchants bringing valuable goods. Marco mentions gold, silver, pearls, gems worth 400,000 byzants annually were paid by the Khan in this paper money.
They had to accept it.
They had to. And citizens had to bring any gold, silver, or precious stones they owned to the mint to be exchanged for paper money. It gave the Khan incredible control over the economy.
Was it stable? What if notes got worn out?
They had a system for that, too. If notes became torn or worn, people could take them back to the mint and exchange them for new ones, but they had to pay a 3% fee.
Even a fee for worn money. Very organized.
Shows real administrative detail, doesn't it?
It does. And speaking of administration, that postal system sounds amazing, too.
Incredible. The Imperial Post, or YAM system. There were relay stations, or post houses, set up every 25 to 30 miles along all the main roads radiating from the capital.
And these stations were well-equipped.
Very well. Each station kept between 300 and 400 horses ready at all times, specifically for imperial messengers. There were comfortable lodgings, too. Even in uninhabited areas, they built these stations.
So messengers could travel fast.
Extremely fast. They could cover 200, even 250 miles in a day. There were also foot runners who carried messages between stations, especially at night, wearing belts with bells to announce their arrival. The whole system was checked monthly to ensure efficiency. It was basically the internet of the 13th century connecting this vast empire.
A logistical marvel. And his tax policies you mentioned, they were kind of a mix of practical and superstitious.
Yeah, it's an interesting blend. On one hand, quite benevolent. If a community suffered a cattle plague, for instance, the Khan would exempt them from taxes for that year and even give them animals from his own tithes to help them recover.
That's generous.
But then, if someone's goods were struck by lightning, maybe their house burned down or their ship was hit, he wouldn't take any taxes or dues from them for 3 years.
Why lightning specifically?
Because they believed lightning was a sign of God's displeasure. The Khan apparently said something like, God hated this man, and he didn't want anything associated with divine wrath ending up in his treasury.
So a blend of practical aid and appeasing divine forces.
Exactly. It seems like this approach helped him maintain control, but also a degree of popular support. He was seen as powerful, maybe a bit frightening, but also potentially caring and attuned to forces beyond the mundane. It likely strengthened his authority across such a diverse empire.
That makes a lot of sense. But Marco Polo's journey wasn't all about imperial grandeur. He also described some really terrifying perils and strange wonders. The desert of Lop, for instance.
Oh, the description of crossing the Gobi, the desert of Laf, is chilling. It took days to cross a vast sandy wasteland.
And he talks about spirits.
Yes. He says travelers crossing the desert, especially at night or if they fell behind their companions, would hear spirits talking. These spirits would sound like members of their own caravan, calling their names.
To lure them away.
Exactly. They'd mimic voices, the sound of musical instruments, even the sound of marching armies trying to draw travelers off the safe path, leading them astray to perish in the desert. Many supposedly died this way.
That sounds terrifying, almost supernatural.
It really does. Seasoned travelers learned coping mechanisms, stay very close together, especially at night, carefully mark the path, put bells on their pack animals so they could hear if one started to stray. It speaks volumes about the psychological toll of crossing such an environment.
A truly dangerous place. And then there are those grim accounts of cannibalism.
Yeah, Marco describes at least 2 instances which are quite shocking to read.
What were they?
In one place, possibly an island, he says if people captured enemies or strangers who couldn't pay a ransom, they wouldn't just kill them, they'd cook and eat them.
As a group.
En famille, Marco says, with their families. They apparently ate everything, even the marrow from the bones. And the justification he reports is bizarre. They believed it prevented worms from consuming the body after death and somehow absolved the deceased's soul of sin.
That's a very specific rationale.
And in another kingdom, he describes magicians determining if a sick person was fated to die. If the verdict was death.
They didn't just let them die.
No, they would suffocate the person. Then the relatives would cook and eat the body, again with a similar justification about it being better for the soul. They also apparently captured and ate any strangers they could who couldn't pay a ransom.
These are deeply unsettling accounts.
They are. And again, we have to consider the lens Marco is viewing this through. But he presents them as observed customs, reflecting the stark, sometimes brutal realities and belief systems in certain isolated parts of the world he traveled through.
Right. Okay, moving away from the grim stuff. He also found unusual resources, like flour from a tree.
Yes. He describes a type of palm tree, probably the sago palm, of great girth and height. People would extract the pith from the trunk, clean it, process it into a kind of flour, and use it to make pastries and other food.
Like an early sustainable food source.
In a way, yeah. Resourcefulness. And then there are the creatures, the legendary griffin birds of Madagascar.
Griffins, half lion, half eagle.
That's the European myth. But Marco says no, the people of Madagascar describe them differently. Not composite creatures, but just absolutely enormous birds of prey, like eagles, but gargantuan.
How big?
He reports their wingspan was 30 paces apace, being about 3 feet, so maybe a 90-foot wingspan. And their feathers were 12 paces long.
90 feet. That's impossible.
It sounds like it. He says they were powerful enough to snatch up an elephant, fly high into the air, and then drop it to kill it before feasting on the carcass.
Okay, that sounds more like maybe a distorted account of the elephant bird, which did exist in Madagascar, though flightless. But the scale is incredible.
It definitely captures a sense of wonder, of a world with creatures far larger and more terrifying than anything known in Europe, maybe based on fossils or exaggerated local stories.
Finally, let's touch on the maritime world he saw. The port of Zayton.
Modern Contiguous. Marco describes it as one of the 2 busiest ports in the entire world at that time, just teeming with ships and trade.
How busy?
He makes this amazing comparison. For every 1 shipload of pepper that goes to Alexandria or elsewhere, destined for Christendom, there come 100 such shiploads to this port of Zayton.
100 times the pepper.
That's the claim. It gives you a sense of the sheer volume of trade flowing into China, bringing immense customs revenues to the Great Khan. It really highlights how much global commerce was happening completely outside Europe's main sphere.
And the ships themselves were different.
Very advanced Chinese junks, built mainly from spruce and pine. Some were huge, with up to 60 private cabins for merchants. 4 masts, sometimes more.
And they had a special safety feature.
This is crucial. Watertight compartments. Marco describes how the hulls were divided into 13 separate compartments by sturdy bulkheads.
Why?
So if the ship struck a reef, or was even holed by a whale, which apparently happened, whales sometimes rammed ships looking for food. Only 1 compartment would flood. The ship wouldn't sink.
That's brilliant, like modern ship design.
Centuries ahead of European shipbuilding in that regard, it made long ocean voyages much safer and points to really sophisticated maritime engineering. He also notes they used ropes made of cane-likely bamboo fibers, which were stronger than European hemp ropes, and even used teams of horses to tow the large ships upstream in rivers.
Just incredible innovation across the board. Okay, let's try to unpack all
Hmm.
this. From, the tiny details of Kublai Khan's court life to the terrifying dangers of the desert. It's just clear Marco Polo's account opens this amazing window onto a world of incredible diversity and, frankly, stunning innovation.
Absolutely. What really stands out when you piece these excerpts together is this picture of a truly uh, globalized world back in the 13th century. You've got these vast trade networks, really advanced infrastructure like the postal system and the shipbuilding.
Yeah, the paper money.
Exactly. And just this astonishing array of cultural norms, beliefs, practices, some familiar, some utterly alien. It really challenges any idea of that era being somehow dark or disconnected.
It does, and it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other hidden depths could we find if we look this closely at other historical figures, even ones we think we know well?
That's the big question, right? How much nuance, how much complexity are we missing by relying on simplified versions of the past?
Indeed, I think our deep dive today really shows that even after, 700 years, the travel still has this power to just astonish and make us think. What really stood out to you listening today from this incredible journey?
There's so much. The scale of the Khan's empire, the resourcefulness, the sheer variety of human experience.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you all a shortcut to being pretty well informed about Marco Polo's world, and maybe hopefully even more curious about the hidden stories that shape how we understand our past.